Last time we talked about the structure of the psyche. We detected 4 basic types of psyche structure and one additional one that people have generated themselves. When various kinds of psychotropics are introduced into the organism, under their impact, the world perception, the physiology of higher nervous activity, and accordingly, the whole work of the psyche also changes. And this type of psyche structure, in the overwhelming majority of cases, does not lead to anything good, due to the fact that the attunement of the biofields of the organism in this variant differs from the genetically given one. It can be characterized as fallen into antinaturalness, and it's regretful to state that people insist on this being normal. Normal in the sense that the statistical norm is such that it is believed to be normal. But there is something else which is of interest. Once there was a talk show on the theme of cultural drinking, and there the question was posed several times. Getting smashed to the point of losing consciousness is understandable. One blisses out, gets away from objective reality as such. But why do people drink culturally? And the answer to this question was not received, although in this talk show this question arose several times. So this is briefly about the previous lecture. Now let's continue. If we consider the psyche as an informational-algorithmic system, then the psyche solves certain governorial tasks. And accordingly, we must have an intelligible view on what governance is in general and how it looks in the concretics of certain technical, social, natural processes, and how to organize processes of governance, how to enter into existing processes of governance. And in processes of governance, far from the last role is played by foreseeing what will happen to the object of governance under the impact of the external environment, internal changes in the object, and the process of governance itself. And even if we don't realize that the psyche solves in some way the task of foresight, nonetheless, it anyway solves it. And it's important to understand that the main task of the worldview and world understanding is to carry out multivariate modeling of the course of events at a pace that anticipates this course, in order to choose, among the plurality of variants, one which will be implemented, or choose a set of mutually nested variants, which will allow the transition from one to the other, if any of the selected variants, by virtue of various reasons, turns out to be impossible to realize. Therefore, the following questions arise. What is a worldview? What is a world understanding? And what variants are possible? And which of the variants is most preferable for us, precisely from the point of view of its effectiveness as an instrument for solving the task of foresight? In fact, psychology and philosophy in their historical form took shape earlier than the time when applied scientific disciplines understood that information is an objective category of creation, as objective as the matter from which this creation is formed in a certain way. Therefore, the language of philosophy and psychology, in those cases when it comes to the worldview and world understanding, is not strictly conceptually determined, and what is said is not always possible to unambiguously connect with what happens in the psyche of every one of us. Nevertheless, in the psyche of each of us, there is a world understanding and there is a world view, and they are somehow connected. They are connected in such a way that the world understanding is impossible without a language. The language of articulate speech, which we speak, or a symbolic language. And worldview is possible without any kind of language. Because it represents an informational duplicate of the world, which, in some way, takes shape in the psyche of man, and which is carried by this material carrier, our organism. There is such a phrase, the Glocki Kustris, Steckli budelt the Bocke, and is kerjacking the buckling. This phrase is attributed to academician Scherba. This is a Soviet linguist. He offered this phrase to students at the first lecture. It shocked them, but still he persistently demanded that they say what it's about. And so they were analyzing the sentence word by word, making assumptions about what it means. This is described in Ouspensky's book, A Word About Words. This is an interesting narration. What are the problems with understanding this phrase? There is a word, and it's impossible to connect any image with it. And all the problems of understanding, they are connected with the fact that it is either possible or impossible to connect some images with words. Therefore, it can be determined that a concept is a one-to-one correspondence in the human psyche of the words of a particular language and the images that have formed in his inner world. These images can be some kind of images of objective reality, or they can be the fruits of his own imagination. Nonetheless, the concept in any case is a univocal correspondence of the words of a language and the image of the inner world. And if you remove the language, what is left? Only images will remain. The whole set of concepts and interconnections between them, which are in man's psyche, can be called world understanding, and the entire set of images with which the concepts that form the world understanding are connected can be called worldview. So this is what we have adopted in the conception of social safety. And then questions arise. What kind of worldview, with which the world understanding is connected through lexicon, can there be? And why is language necessary, if there is a worldview and in some way it can be conveyed? The reality is such that the worldview and language are connected with each other through nraviousness. One of these striking examples on this theme is the film by Leni Riefenstahl about the Nazi Party convention which took place in 1936. Leni Riefenstahl is considered a genius of cinematography of the 20th century. Her film Olympia, about the Berlin Olympics, is considered by many to be one of the best films of all time about sports. While she was filming it, kilometers of film were used. All this was viewed. She edited the film herself. For the first time, new techniques of filming and editing, which later became classics for sports documentary filmmaking, were applied. It so happened that Leni Riefenstahl lived in the Third Reich, worked in it, and made a film called Triumph of Will. This film is banned in many countries because it's considered to be Nazi propaganda, and many figures of Nazi Germany in the 1930s were convinced that Leni Riefenstahl did more to spread Nazism with her film than any of the propagandists of Hitler's party. Now, let's look at the same film, the same documentary, from a different, nraviousness ethical standpoint. And if it gets the name, not Triumph of Will, but Apotheosis of Willlessness, then everything will fall into its place. And this, with the same documentary, would be one of the most striking anti-fascist films. Seemingly nothing has changed. The documentary is still the same. And what types of worldview and world understanding are there? There is such a children's toy, a kaleidoscope. A kaleidoscope is a prism, the inner surface of which is mirrored, usually formed by three facets. One end of the prism rests against a container in which multicolored pieces of glass are located. One side of this container adjoins the end of the prism, the other side is covered with frosted glass, and the other end of the prism is a peephole into which one looks. If you rotate the kaleidoscope, the pieces of glass form patterns, and the internal mirror of the prism duplicates them many times, and you see a very interesting picture. The kaleidoscope is characterized by the fact that all its elements are not connected with each other. On the other hand, there is a genre of fine art called mosaics, or stained glass windows. There too, elements, seemingly scattered, are nevertheless connected and form a single picture. And this picture, if it's the genre of fine art, is somehow connected with the theme of artistic work and objective reality. All elements of the mosaic are characterized by the fact that every one of them is in its place. And this location is determined by other elements of the mosaic and by the general picture in which it participates and its own role in this very picture. If one element is removed from the mosaic, then it appears flawed. And if we don't have enough resolution of the mosaic, that is, detailedness, we can remove its fragment and replace it with some more detailed fragment. These images, kaleidoscopes and mosaics, give an idea of what two extreme types, the worldview and world understanding of a person, can be. Either everything is interconnected, then it's a mosaic worldview, world understanding, or it is a kaleidoscope, where there may be many interesting facts and little facts. They seem to be scattered. All connections between them are established in some way, and the establishment of connections is random, in the sense that some statistical regularities, but not those objective interconnections that exist in the real world, are realized. And these statistical regularities, not of the objective world, but the statistical regularities of the reaction of the psyche, which carries this kaleidoscopic worldview to the objective world. That is, connections are dictated by the objective world through the randomness of the psyche, and therefore they are not predictable. And if the world changes, the connections change. Then the worldview and the world understanding change continuously. And the kaleidoscopic worldview, in which everything is scattered, is a very bad model in order to model the course of events in the world at a pace outstripping their real course. And accordingly, the choice of variants of behavior turns out to be impossible. And the second variant of the worldview and world understanding is a mosaic worldview and world understanding. Everything in it is interconnected, and if something is insufficiently detailed, then a set of some new concepts, some elements of the worldview appears, and some interconnections are established by the previously existing system. However, the mosaic worldview, in turn, can also be presented in two variants. Variant 1. The formation of the mosaic is carried out in the direction from the particularity to the general. Variant 2. The formation of the mosaic, its development and detailization, is carried out in the direction from the general to the particularity. It would seem that both the one and the other are mosaics. But what is the difference? And the difference is approximately such that if you order a certain construction set, it comes, it is chock full of all sorts of details, but there are no assembly instructions. There is no idea about the general appearance of the product. There are many parts. Then in the overwhelming majority of cases, you will not be able to assemble the thing that this construction set represents on the first try unmistakably. Because somewhere, somehow, you will break the order. But if you have a general idea of what you should get in the end, then most likely you can carry out the technological process of assembling this something whole from many parts. And it turns out that the process of forming a mosaic, its development, detailization, if it flows in the direction from the general to the particularity, has a higher stability and higher immunity to interference than the process of assembling a mosaic in the direction from the particularities to the general. Let's take a look at our life. How are each of our pictures of the world formed? We come into the world when the picture of the world in our psyche is in some rudimentary state. And if someone was born with a damaged system of sensory organs, he is blind, deaf from birth, then the personality is not formed, because information does not enter the psyche. There is no worldview, no world understanding. And in fact, the person's organism, with informational-algorithmic provision, is at a level something like between plants and the animal world. This was the case for centuries, until, in the 20th century, methods of pedagogical socialization of such children were worked out. When, bypassing the missing channels of world perception through touch, it is after all still possible to reach the human soul, and in some way, the worldview and world understanding take shape. And if the child is born with a normal, standard set of senses, then let's remember how we grew up. Self-awareness is the awareness of what? This is the awareness, first of all, of your substantial body. The picture of the world understanding, the picture of the world perception, it is formed through our eye. But in relation to creation, our eye is some very, very small particular. It interacts with other such particularities in creation, which are in the circle of perception of our senses. And so it turns out that we all, over the course of a long period of time, live in such a way that either a kaleidoscopic worldview or a mosaic worldview takes shape, but it's always I-centric. Because I, in the consciousness of most people, is the body first of all. Further, clothes appear on the body, women have cosmetics, then a car, an apartment, a house, and everything goes on, expanding from the beloved self to the limits of the universe. If the play in the mind reaches the boundaries of the world perception, then the world beyond the boundaries of the world perception also exists. And then begins the replenishment of what is within the limits of one's own world perception, also by other people's fictions about what is outside the world perception. From here stem such things as the hefty earth disk that lies on the backs of elephants. The elephants, in turn, stand on the shell of a turtle, and so on and so forth. And on the basis of this world perception, in the continuity of generations, the whole science developed. Because Newton once said, "If I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants." Even if we talk about the fact that we all stand on the shoulders of past generations, and therefore we see a little further than they did, then anyway, we see from the point where humanity is in the universe. And the question is the picture of the world that is drawn by the I-centric worldview, and which is generated as an I-centric worldview and world understanding, adequate or not? The era before the 19th century, and the 19th century in part, were characterized by the fact that in science, opinions were free. And what is commonly called the mainstream did not exist. Therefore, there was a little more freedom in expressing the views on the world than there is now. Systems of education were also not so all-encompassing. Therefore, a certain number of people, nonetheless, after all, were engaged in self-education more intensively than now. And books were published for their interests. One of these books is Primary School Reader by Vodovozov, which tells about the worldview and world understanding of the ancient Egyptians. According to their views, as Vodovozov writes, the god Ra was a four-hypostatic being. His hypostasis can be called in the modern Russian language substance, that which exists, spirit, that which permeates the substance and sets it in motion, gives meaning to the substance. Space, filled by substance and spirit, and time, in which substance and spirit change in some way. Let's turn to modern physics. The space-time continuum is filled with matter in various aggregate states. If we analyze these aggregate states, then matter is divided into two categories: physical fields and various kinds of elementary particles, which, depending on the nature of interconnections between them, are either single particles, or plasma, or matter in solid, liquid, or gaseous state. Scientologists. Hubbard allegedly made the greatest of scientific discoveries. He allegedly created a worldview system based on the categories MEST, matter, energy, space-time, in which there resides man, denoted by the letter theta. The whole system is called theta mest. Everything that concerns MEST, according to the first letters of the English words, matter, energy, space, time, this is again the recognizable ancient Egyptian Ra. And theta? Theta, since ancient times in various esoteric traditions, has been the symbol of man's soul. And since this letter is such an oval crossed by a wave, in many esoteric traditions, theta was the symbol of the soul, and its upper half denoted the non-incarnate phase of being, that is, when the soul lives but the organism does not have a body, and its lower half denoted the incarnate phase of the being of the soul, and thus theta was the symbol of the cycle of reincarnation of the soul. Yes, it looks like a yin-yang, only a yin-yang, it is round, and theta is vertical and compressed, and it's also like a wave. Yes, in the Russian alphabet it was called fita, and then it disappeared. It was eliminated as There was talk about this before the revolution, but after the revolution, it was eliminated along with yat and the hard sign. The point is not about provisional, not provisional, but the point is why. What served as its basis? If, nonetheless, we proceed from the fact that the Russian language is a phonetic writing system, first of all, then if there were those letters in it, then to all appearances they denoted different sounds. This is like in the Arabic language, where there are several sounds which, to our crude ear, are a variety of either ge or khe. But these are different sounds. We don't distinguish them. If our speech over time has become phonetically poorer, then more or less similar in sounds have united, and the letters that denote them have become unnecessary in the modern language. Accordingly, the images have been lost. And in addition, there is another side of the question. Language, as a means of transmitting information, it is articulate speech. If you look at it precisely as an instrument for transmitting information, it is extremely ineffective. Because here we are sitting, discussing different things. It's already the fourth day, every day for 2 hours. And what we are discussing, before my inner gaze, what has already been told, and what has not been told, can slip into the entirety in some moments. The main function of language is not at all the passing of certain meanings from one person to another. The main function of language is direct governance towards the course of processes in the universe, in society. Because when we say something, we emit these oscillations into the surrounding world. The surrounding world is also an oscillatory system. Something might fall into resonances. If it falls into resonances, there occur changes of state, including irreversible ones. And if there is a cascade of retranslators, then sending some sequence of harmonics can bring the cascade of retranslators into operation. And there, somewhere, something will happen. If we foresee what and how will happen, then we go beyond the limitations of Chuchev. It is not given us to foretell how our words will echo through the ages. And the difference between oral speech and internal monologue is only in the fact that oral speech directly affects the mechanical, vibroacoustic, material world, and the internal monologue flows on other physical carriers, in the fields inherent for man's biofield, in a different frequency range, and affects everything through more subtle levels of organization of matter, some cascades of retranslators. And in addition, man's organism, its field system, as I said last time, can abide in 2 states. Some fields can be enclosed on themselves, and there can be states when the fields are enclosed on similar fields on other objects. And then, if the fields are enclosed on other objects, then we, by sending some sequence of harmonics along these fields, exert a direct field impact on these objects. What happens there and how is an open question, but nonetheless, physics is such that man cannot live otherwise. If the fields are enclosed on themselves, and we chase some thoughts, and energies with which we chase are excessive in relation to the capacity of our organism, then we can cause ourselves a stroke, heart attack, the rapid development of oncology, and many other troubles. But these are all other themes. It turns out that since ancient times, the system of ultimate generalizations, as well as of primary differences that describe creation, has been unchanged. It is represented by this set of four components: space, time, which are repositories for creation, which is matter and spirit. Spirit permeates matter, sets it in motion, and gives meaning to being. That is, there has been no worldview progress since the times of ancient Egypt either. Why can this system not be accepted as satisfactory? Because the reality is such that in the spirit there is hidden two such categories as information, that is, meaning, and algorithmics and codes, a system for coding information, because meanings don't exist without a coding system in the real world. The technosphere provides many examples of this, but the technosphere is also a part of objective reality, and the same objective laws are realized in it as are realized in the life of any element in creation. Here is a picture, a landscape behind the window. We invite an artist with an easel, he paints, a landscape appears on the canvas. We take a film camera, put it on a tripod, press a button, carry out the entire cycle of film processing and printing, we get the same landscape. We take a digital camera, carrying out a sequence of electrical impulses through the device, we get a view of the same landscape. The image is the same. In nature, on the artist's canvas, on the film, in the display of the device with which the digital camera works, what's different? Material carriers are different. And moreover, different material carriers can have different information coding systems, because the same landscape as a computer file can be represented in a variety of formats that are currently used and that can be invented and used in the future. That is, the image of this landscape itself remains unchanged, regardless of what material carriers and what coding systems it is presented in. On the other hand, the same coding systems, for example the JPG format, can be a repository for different images. In the computer of every one of us, there is a photo library where there are landscapes, portraits of ourselves, friends, loved ones, some other photographs, and everything is presented in the same format. This gives an idea that another system of ultimate generalizations or primary differences with which we can describe creation is possible. This system, in the terminology of modern science, can be called the triunity of matter, information, and measure. Matter, This is what creation consists of, what is transformed in it. Information. This is images, meanings that are in themselves unchanging, regardless of material carriers. And measure. This is an ultimate generalization, which, in relation to matter, represents a matrix of its possible states and possible transitions from one stable state to others. In relation to information, measure is a system for coding information and all kinds of algorithms for the transformation of information. This system of ultimate generalizations, or primary differences, enables one to describe the same creation, which is described in the I-centric system of four, the unity of space, time, matter and spirit. Only this will open up new facets of reality and some vices of the previous system. There is the phrase of Blessed Augustine, the meaning of which is that until he is asked what time is, everything is clear to him, and as soon as he is asked, then the understanding, the clarity of perception immediately disappear. The situation with space is approximately the same. Moreover, the models of modern physics are such that in some of them, the dimensionality of space at the macro and micro levels are different. That is, at the macro level, it is a three-dimensional world. And at the micro level, in one of the models, it is an 11-dimensional world. But if this is one and the same space, then why is it three-dimensional at the macro level and different at the micro level? It is 11-dimensional. If you look at how things are in a situation with measurement, then with matter everything is clear. Kilogram, mole, electron volt, since physics recognizes the equivalence of mass and energy. What about space? What about time? There are two standards in the Institute of Weights and Measures in St. Petersburg. One lamp is the standard of time. The other lamp is the standard of space, a standard of length. Each lamp emits monochrome light of a certain frequency. In relation to the meter, a certain number of wavelengths of this lamp is a meter. In relation to the second, a certain number of complete periods of oscillation of the other lamp is 1 second. The question is, why are two standard lamps needed? In principle, nothing prevents one from using one lamp, saving energy, not being preoccupied with its structure, reproduction, and, based on the length of oscillations generated by the other lamp, one can determine the length of a meter and the duration of a second. To all appearances, psychological inertia works. The measure of space is a meter, the measure of time is a second, they must be separated. But let's look further. The measure of the amount of matter is the kilogram. There is a standard kilogram. Why is your standard meter? First it's a bar made of platinum and an iridium alloy, then something else, now it's the number of wavelengths. Show us the meter, as a standard for measuring space made from space. Show us a second as a standard for measuring time made from time. If you turn to physicists with these proposals, physicists will take them as a joke. And if you insist on this, then there will either be hysterics on the theme that you don't know physics, you live in total ignorance, or if you keep persisting, they will call psychiatrists. But nonetheless, such questions are natural, objective. But under the system of ultimate generalizations, matter, spirit, space and time, there is no answer to them. But in the system of the triunity of matter, information and measure, there are answers to these questions, because both space and time, in this case, are the generation of matter in accordance with the matrix of its being. And here, nothing prevents the space at the macro level from being three-dimensional, and at the micro level, 11-dimensional or however much dimensional. But if space and time are a generation of matter, then it's clear that there can be no standards of space made from space, and no standards of time made from time. But the co-measurement of various fragments of the material creation requires the introduction of a standard of co-measurement of space. It can be a meter or something else. But since this is about the co-measurement of material objects, then the standard must also, of course, be material. But since it's about co-measurement, then what we choose as a standard is subjective, and the only question is how subjectively convenient the choice of standard is. The situation from the cartoon about 38 parrots, when the boa constrictor is concerned about how long he is, the parrot measures him with himself and declares, "You are 38 parrots long and one small wing." Then the monkey does the same, and the boa sums up, "In parrots, I am much longer." But if it were not for the subjective solution of the parrot, the boa constrictor would have remained unmeasured in a certain unit length of the boa constrictor himself, which would act as a standard in relation to himself. The situation with time is approximately the same, because the whole history of measuring time is a question of correlating the flow of processes in the material world with a certain standard process. What could be the standard process? History knows all kinds of processes. An hourglass as a standard, clepsydra where water drips instead of sand can also be a standard. You don't like the subjectivity of such a clock? Please use an astronomical standard. And there are two of them: the daily rhythm of the rotation of the Earth and the annual cycle of the planet's movement around the orbit. In a number of cultures, the standard of historical time is a change of dynasties. Now the technology has reached the point that they decided that the transition of an electron from one orbit to another is accompanied by the emission of light, and the wavelength of this lamp is the standard. The duration of the period of the other lamp, emitting a different wave of light, is the standard of a second. But here, everything falls into place, and at the same time, those possibilities open up that were closed in the world understanding on the basis of the four-component set. Because when it comes to the fact that spirit permeates nature and sets it in motion, substance in motion, this corresponds to the fact that physical fields interact with matter in different forms of state. When it comes to the fact that spirit carries meanings, then it's about the fact that there is some information and there are some processes of its transformation. There are coding systems. Since ancient times, there has been such a direction as numerology, according to which all life is subordinate to numbers. Yes, indeed, it is subordinate. In the periodic table of elements of Mendeleev, this subordination is clearly expressed. But in the worldview of the triunity of matter, information, measure, this is a particular case of the fact that measure really manifests itself in life, creation as a whole, and each of its fragments. If we try to describe processes in the categories matter, space, time, spirit, then everything that concerns informational-algorithmic processes is somehow hidden in spirit. And every researcher reveals this non-determination in his own words, and another researcher reveals this in his own words. Therefore, in the field of humanitarian disciplines, which aspire to describe man in other aspects, but not in Platonic ones, like two-legged creature without feathers and with wide nails, it turns out that it's impossible to agree, since there is subjectivism. And if certain subjectivism becomes more or less widespread and generally accepted, then yes, its supporters can understand each other. An example of this is all the followers of Gumilyov's theory of passionarity. But if we turn to the theory of passionarity itself, then the term passionarity turns out to be metrologically inconsistent in the theories of natural science. If we correlate, if we analyze what Gumilyov understands by ethnos, then in one case, in order to say this is ethnos, one single statement, we are not like others, is enough, and in other cases, in order to characterize ethnos, quite a large amount of features are required, including characteristics of the landscape, because, according to his theory, ethnogenesis is an extra-social process, but conditioned by the nature where ethnogenesis occurs, that is, a landscape. Yes, we can say that Gumilyov was the first to point out in science that ethnogenesis is a process in which out-of-social factors are also involved. But we cannot say that Gumilyov satisfactorily described ethnogenesis, its dynamics and cause-effect relationships that take place in ethnogenesis. That is, described satisfactorily, we cannot say this, because the theory of passionarity was generated in line with this conception of a four-component set of ultimate generalizations, and expresses some so-called spirituality. Khrushchevsky's aphorism is also connected with this. The regularity of historical phenomena is inversely proportional to their spirituality. But if the term of mathematics, inversely proportional, is used, then there arises a question of measurability. How to measure spirituality? There are no answers to this in the I-centric worldview and world understanding on the basis of the four-component set of matter, spirit, space, and time. Again, if we talk about the development of science, the division of matter into substance and spirit also stems from our I-centrism, because the division into substance and spirit occurred on the basis of man's world perception. That which is visible and tangible is substance. That which is invisible and intangible, but nonetheless exists, and its existence is manifested in the impact on what is visible and tangible. This is spirit. But in the history of all peoples, all cultures, there have been people who, for various reasons, had a wider measure of perception than others. Therefore, in a number of cases they saw fields, heard outside the range of normal for man perception. And if their world perception were the norm, then there would be a different system of ultimate generalizations, also stemming from I-centrism, connected with man's organism and system of his sense organs. Further, it turns out that the alternative to the I-centric set has also been known since ancient times, because in a number of Kabbalistic texts, it is directly said that the world is a triunity of matter, information, measure, that are named in the language of that era. But behind those terms, if we talk about the properties of everything that is discussed there, then one can see what in scientific terminology is now called matter, information, measure. In the Quran, the 25th Surah is called distinction or criterion. It contains the phrase, "He hath created everything, and hath meted out for it a measure." In other versions of the translation, it says that everything exists in accordance with the predetermination of God, and the images of everything stem from predetermination. If we interpret these Quranic messages in the terminology of modern science, then we again come to the triunity of matter, information, and measure. Therefore, the question arises: two systems of ultimate generalizations have existed since ancient times, but one is a cult, on the basis of which a generally accessible science develops, a system of education is built. As already shown, the system has certain defects that do not allow describing some phenomena in the world, while the other system is free of these defects. Why then is the first one cultic, and the other is secret or unwanted? The answer to this question is of a two-aspected character. Because if you use a more perfect system of world understanding, then in some situations you will have an advantage over those who use a more primitive system. And in cases where their prognostics is erroneous, you will be able to get a life-consistent prognosis. In the end, this creates a system of dependence of those who use a more primitive system on those who use a more perfect system. This is one side of the question. The second side of the question is that the system of the triunity of matter, information, measure does not arise by itself, automatically, from the I-centric perception, strictly attached to man's organism. That is, it can arise either as a product of man's intellectual activity, or as offered to man from the outside, and with which he must, on the basis of some pondering, either agree or reject. Another theme of the Quranic revelation is that the creators of historically real Judaism concealed part of the knowledge that was given to Moses for the enlightenment of all people. But the question of concealment is closely related to the question that if we have an advantage, then everyone else depends on us. And in this case, we have the opportunity to manipulate them and engage ourselves in what in Marxism is called exploitation of man by man. In these words, the phrase man by man must be enclosed in quotation marks, because for a human, another man cannot be an object of exploitation. Exploitation implies building a purpose-oriented system when some work and others use the products of their labor in a predominant way, and they themselves receive the products of their labor according to the leftover principle. Like in a turbojet aircraft engine, the compressor is needed because it pumps air into the turbine, but the compressor absorbs the energy that the turbine produces. Here it's about the same, that from the point of view of aircraft engine developers, it would be desirable to reduce the share of energy absorbed by the compressor, so that the efficiency from the turbine would be greater. And, from the point of view of building crowd elite systems, ideally, such a system where the exploited consume a minimum, the feedback from them is maximum, but they get a minimum. And the elite is what it is. They live for their pleasure on everything ready, either without taking part in labor activities at all, or taking part in some prestigious or other preferential for them areas of activity that provide sufficient free time and a high level of security. Therefore, it turns out that the four-component worldview, it takes shape by itself on the basis of natural development of man's organism on the basis of information brought by his senses. But it turns out in the final analysis to be not completely full-fledged. And by its structure, to all appearances, it is also characteristic of the worldview that exists in the psyche of sufficiently highly developed animals. If we correlate with the religious worldview, then, in the Abrahamic religions, in their original versions, the mission of man is to be the successor of God on earth. And accordingly, at that stage of personal development, when the child moves from what in the adult state is called the demonic type of structure of the psyche to the human type of structure of the psyche, when he ponders on the objectiveness of dobro and evil, on the fact that his limited capabilities should always be in harmony with life, with the unlimitedness of the universe, he somehow must come to religious problematics. And accordingly, at about this time, on the basis of his intellectual efforts, man must move from the I-centric world understanding to the God-centric world understanding, which has been given to humanity repeatedly in revelations, and which is built on the basis of ultimate generalizations or the primary distinctions of the triunity of matter, information, and measure. If you look at this world understanding, then it unfolds in the direction from the general to the particular. Because there is life, and life represents God and the created by Him creation. And creation is the triunity of matter, information, and measure in various images that appear before people at various levels of organization of creation. The system of ultimate distinctions is the same for the descriptions of the macro world and the micro world, processes in society and processes in technology. And this way, a mosaic picture of the world understanding and a mosaic worldview take shape. The mosaic picture in its general outline is the same for everyone, and the distinctions, connected with the distinctions of people's destinies, with the distinctions in their professional activities, as a result of which some people have some elements of this picture worked out in more detailedness, others in less detailedness, but mutual understanding and interaction between them is possible, since in this picture of the world, it is always possible to work out some details that separate the areas of competence of each of them and obtain mutual understanding in line with the encompassing processes. But in conditions of I-centrism, there, by virtue of the peculiarities of the system of ultimate generalizations, it is far from always possible for specialists in different fields to agree with each other, since many questions of metrological support of activities in principle cannot be solved. Since a lot of things are hidden in the concept of spirit, which does not have an unambiguous, in terms of metrological consistency, definition. Therefore, if we talk about a taken-place human, then this presupposes, in addition to the human type of psyche structure, a stable, irreversible human type of psyche structure, unchanging in all circumstances of life, in wakefulness and in sleep. This also presupposes a transition from the I-centric system of world understanding, from the I-centric worldview, to the Mosaic world understanding on the basis of the triunity of matter, information, measure. In this case, man can solve many problems of life and carry out the mission of the successorship of God on earth. This opens up another theme, because last time it was said that the reproduction of generations of people throughout the entire memorable history is subjugated to pan-biospheric laws, according to which the birth rate always exceeds the capacity of the ecological niche, after which the excessive ones die, either in intraspecific competition or under the impact of natural factors and other biological species. Because everything in the biosphere is connected by trophic chains. That is, everyone eats each other. Hence, wars and criminality, as ineradicable factors in the life of society, in which the norm has not become the human type of psyche structure, which everyone should achieve by the beginning of adolescence, if adolescence is determined by the moment when the formation of the structure of the organism and the psyche of the individual has not yet completed, but sexual instincts have awakened. But if there is a human type of psyche structure, and we live in a culture in which this is the norm for all adults, which everyone achieves in their personal development by the beginning of adolescence, then what? Then it turns out that a person who has reached the human type of psyche structure, he turns out to be emotionally self-sufficient in all circumstances of life. And this leads to the question of the place and role of emotions in the psyche of man. Let's take a look. Man solves some governorial tasks. His consciousness has, in an ordinary state, in an unchanged state, a very limited performance speed. 15 bits per second, 7 to 9 objects at the same time, and the world is described with a much larger number of parameters than 7 to 9. And in those processes of governance in which man participates, these parameters also somehow change. So where and how does all this information go? And the role of emotions in the human psyche makes it possible to understand such an engineering analogy. Imagine that we are constructing a certain system. The operator must sit at the control panel and control the course of certain processes. Since there is only one operator, the possibilities of his consciousness are limited. We can put a limited number of parameters on the control panel, on the monitors of devices, or on the display. And in this case, we then display the most important parameters on these devices, or on the interface. And what about the rest of the parameters? If everything is going well, the operator does not need to know them. But if something does not go normally, then we must display them either on additional monitors or put them on the display and attract the operator's attention. And accordingly, on the control panel we have a bulb that lights up green when everything goes well. If something goes wrong, the light turns red, and maybe a beep is given to draw the attention of the operator. If the light comes on in red, then the operator turns to the system and receives on the monitor a display of those parameters that cause the red light, and he makes some governorial efforts in order to bring the system to such a mode when the control parameters are displayed and the light is green. Another variant is possible. The signal light bulb is on as brightly as if it were a light fixture. Functionally, emotions in the psyche of man are analogous to such a green light bulb. That is, if everything goes well, then the emotions should be good. If emotions go off scale, this means that in the energy sector there are some disruptions, and this green light starts to work not in a signaling mode, but in a lighting device mode. That is, everything is not normal. If cats scratch your soul, which means there are negative emotions, then this means that some information has entered the unconscious levels of the psyche, which suggests that something is somehow wrong. And this circumstance leads to the question of what is the best emotion-meaning structure. For a person who lives outside religiosity and takes atheistic positions, this question is meaningless, because there is such an anecdote. Carabas Barabas is sitting by the fireplace, Buratino is burning in the fireplace, their turtle tortilla soup is being cooked in a saucepan, the poodle barks on a chain behind the door, the raped Malvina lies in the bed, and Carabas Barabas, being pleased, says, "Well, it's just some kind of fairy tale. One can only dream about it." He has good emotions, and the comprehended meaningfulness against the background of which these emotions take place is evil. And accordingly, the question arises of how to determine the mutual correspondence of meaningfulness, emotions, in relation to the distinctiveness of objective dobro and evil. In the religious world understanding, the answer to this question is simple. The Almighty is not mistaken, and that everything that happens in life in the best possible way. If we talk about society, then it should be said with a reservation, in accordance with the enraviousness and ethics that are inherent for people. And this should evoke extremely bright emotions in a person without him going off scale. And the main question in psychological practice is that any person can learn how to evoke bright emotions against the background of the thought that the Almighty is not mistaken. This is not easy to do, because when a person abides in the I-centric world perception, world understanding, that is, burdened with a bunch of problems, and in some cases troubles, emotions can be negative, or he can be depressed, a complete absence of emotions. The thought that the Almighty is infallible, nonetheless, should cause positive emotions. You can catch this tuning for a fraction of a second or a second volitionally, even in difficult situations. But after you catch it for the first time, you can learn how to support it all the time, including in interaction with everyday situations and very difficult, sometimes tragic everyday situations. But nonetheless, it's necessary to learn how to do it. If this is achieved, then a whole bunch of related phenomena is also achieved. Why? Because when man abides in such an emotion-meaning structure, his psyche correctly processes the entire flow of information with which he is dealing. If his psyche processes this information correctly, then it makes fewer mistakes in its processing. And as a result of making fewer mistakes, the consequences of past mistakes are eliminated. And new mistakes, due to the fact that they are not made, do not cause negative consequences in the future. And therefore, life becomes, over time, as if by itself better. That is, there are no unforeseen troubles. What can become potentially unpleasant no longer becomes disasters, but threats of disasters, difficulties that the person is ready to overcome in advance. Because it turns out that in a number of cases, the information necessary to overcome these difficulties was embedded in his psyche in childhood, proactively, tens of years ahead. But only in the correct emotion-meaning structure is the person able to use this information. If the emotion-meaning structure is wrong, then the man is strong in hindsight. After having made a mess, he can comprehend what he should have done, and this, in principle, could have enabled him not to have made this mess.
То есть вы считаете, что если человек делает какое-то дело, и у него хорошие эмоции, хорошее настроение, он чувствует, что ему это не противно, ему это интересно, это показатель того, что он делает правильно.
No, this does not mean that he is doing the right thing, because this can be, as in that anecdote with Karabas-Barabas. How can one understand? This here phrase, that the Almighty is not mistaken, and positive emotions must correspond to it, is a tuning fork of the psyche of the organism. After all, how does it work? You take a guitar off the wall. The guitar has hung on the wall for, say, 3 or 4 months. The humidity changed, something else changed. You start playing, and the guitar is not tuned anymore. You hit the strings right, but it's not that music that you want. It is some kind of cacophony. What to do? You have to take the guitar and tune it right. Then you can play whatever music you want. But the process of tuning the guitar, this is not music. The process of tuning your guitar is a preparation for music. But this is necessary, and with the psyche of man, the situation is exactly the same. We allow ourselves to wake up in the mood that has somehow already taken shape, and for some reason we start doing something. And the reality is such that upon waking up, we must provide the correct emotion meaning structure. When we provide it, only after that can we start doing something. If we see, discover, catch ourselves on the fact that the emotion meaning structure has gone astray, then it must be restored. Therefore, in the Muslim tradition, Muslims are prescribed a 5 times a day prayer, because the prayer itself is an instrument for restoring a normal emotion meaning structure for a person, not to mention the fact that although many do not know this and don't understand, but the order of the body movements in the Muslim prayer ritual, this is also a procedure for tuning the organism, bringing it into the right state. Those who are not Muslims must solve the same problems in some other way. And for them, this is solved on the basis of automatic reproduction of the ritual, on the condition that the person does not worship the prayer rug, but enters into prayer communication with God.
Может быть, изначально замысел такой был, когда в Коране говорилось о 5 молитвах, но не имелось в виду, что они вот так это все реализуют.
In general, the reality is such that real Islam is very far from what Muhammad was carrying to the people. And this is their problem. But the problem of all mankind is the transition to a culture in which the human type of psyche structure is achieved by adolescence. And everyone lives with this psyche for the rest of his life. And then it turns out that if you live and the tuning fork is correct, the Almighty is infallible, and the correct emotions correspond to this, then if something is wrong, then it rises either on the level of consciousness explicitly, or emotions appear. In other words, against the background of the fact that emotions are good, cats suddenly start scratching your soul, as they say. Then you need to stop your activity, return to the normal emotion meaning structure, and ask the depths of your own psyche, why are cats scratching my soul? What is it? What to do? The answer usually arises. If you skip this moment, then it turns out that the scratching of cats on your soul was a manifestation of the prerequisites, moreover, I emphasize, the prerequisites, of some troubles that happened later. That is, at the moment the cats began to scratch your soul, you could have prevented the trouble, in some cases simply by the thought, let it not be so, or by some other action.
Михаил Владимирович, хотел уточнить, правильно ли я понял вот из сказанного по поводу пятикратного молебного мусульман, да, и то, что их вот именно молитва, она происходит в виде, в том числе не только вот какого-то внутреннего там духовного общения, да, там произнесения каких-то слов в виде информационного кода, но и вот физических упражнений, если так сказать, те же поклоны, да?
Да.
Можно ли это сопоставить с тем, что если мы говорим о начале дня, да, о необходимости производить настройку не только ума, но и тела в виде зарядки?
I don't know, in the form of exercising or not. Now pay attention. A cat is awake about 37% of the time of the day. The rest of the time the cat sleeps. When the cat wakes up, what does it do? It stretches. It stretches all the muscles, forward and backward, in all directions and the way it can. The cat has no single stiff muscle after it wakes up, as it stretches. What does this give? In fact, about 30 to 40% of the work of pumping blood in the human body is carried out by skeletal muscles. And if the muscle tone has fallen, then, even with a trained heart, the effect is the same as in acute heart failure. Therefore, one of the mysteries of physical education is the mystery of governing one's own tone. And if you just wake up and do the stretching correctly, then it's better than going to the gym and doing who knows what there. Because if a person masters the skills of governing his muscle tone, then it does not consume a lot of time and energy like a gym, but gives great results. In addition, in most cases we move incorrectly. That is, there is a certain genetically programmed gracefulness of movements. As for the cat, its gracefulness is not disturbed. Look, the cat sits, its back is like a wheel. But no one says that the cat is stooped, because this is a phase of a certain movement. Look at our contemporaries, at the youth. There are practically no people with correct posture. The consequences of this are simple. Because everything in the organism is interconnected, and each organ emits some of its own biofields in which other organs work. One of the variants of diabetes mellitus of the second type, the kidneys are displaced relative to their ideal anatomical position by 1.5 or 2 centimeters. It is treated for a week with massage and gymnastics, which bring the kidneys to their anatomically ideal state. Therefore, all sorts of posture disorders, displacement of organs relative to their anatomically ideal positions under the impact of the spread of fat deposits between the structures of the organism, is a very great harm to health. Harm that cannot be eliminated with medication. It can be eliminated only by returning the organs to their anatomically ideal positions. This is only part of the question. And the second part of the question is connected with movement. The following situations are widespread. One turns, unsuccessfully, something cracks in one's own back. One tries to lift a weight and strain something somewhere, and so on. What happens in all such cases? If, in terms of strength of materials, at some points of the organism, of the muscular system, in the ligaments, in the joints, the stresses under the impact of efforts exceed those stresses that are extreme for the organism. Further, it turns out that man can take poses in which the stress in all muscles is more or less the same. That is, these poses can be called equal strength. In such poses, a person can take a very large mechanical load on his organism, but apart from everything else, man is able to flow, that is, smoothly transition from one equal strength pose to another one. and the plastic in which man transitions from one equal strength pose to other equal strength poses is close to that genetically programmed gracefulness of movement that is suppressed by our culture. But if man learns to move in a holistic manner, flowing from one equal pose to another, then he can go up to the refrigerator, squat down, stretch out his arms, lift it, stand up with his refrigerator in his hands, and carry it. A child at the age of 6 to 7, possessing the plasticity of equal strength movement, is capable of neutralizing a 90-kilogram knuckle dragger, replete with ambition of coolness. If the latter does not possess this very plasticity of equal strength movement. Why? Because the child, by grabbing that guy's finger or his ear, can bring him into a pose in which his stress, in some muscle or in a ligament, will exceed the pain threshold, and that's it. And when our Belinas tell us that there the Bogatyr took one of the opponents by the legs and swung him around, as a result of which everyone fell down, from our point of view this is hyperbole, that is, an exaggeration. And with a different look, this is simply an indication that the Bogatyr possessed the plasticity of equal strength movement, which his opponents did not possess. And, among other things, we know Newton's third law. Every action, force, has an equal and opposite reaction. In the 1970s, they once showed a film, a newsreel named Achievements of Science and Technology, or I Want to Know Everything. A jackhammer, created somewhere in the Kiev Institute, weighing 2.5 or 3 kilograms. The only steel part is a chisel, everything else is plexiglass. In this jackhammer, Newton's third law is violated, as a result of which, in its effectiveness, it surpasses this mine jackhammer, which breaks coal and which weighs who knows how much. Why? Because in mechanics, in addition to the dynamics of collision of bodies, some wave processes can also arise. Now, if there is a snap of the fingers, then this is not only a snap, it is also the dispersion of a wave. And under certain conditions, with certain skills, a snap can cause such a shock wave in the enemy's body, which is typical to receive in the case of shell shock as a result of an explosion of something voluminous nearby. Therefore, the world in which we live is somewhat different from how we are accustomed to thinking. There are a lot of things in it, but we have digressed from the theme. So, if there is emotional self-sufficiency, then man, on the basis of this tuning fork that the Almighty is not mistaken, turns out to be independent of many things, including instinctively conditioned pleasures, and accordingly, there is a restructuring of the physiology of the organism, and man enters the mode when children cease to be an accidental product of instinctively conditioned sexual desires. If you correlate with the idea that the soul is given incarnation in order for man to learn to love, then you can love only at least for a few moments, reaching the human type of psyche structure. And then, the reproduction of generations will not proceed under the dictatorship of instincts, as, for example, in New York, the substation was cut out, it was dark, after 9 months all the maternity hospitals were full, and children will be conceived, nurtured and born, and brought up in love. And this will also be a specimen, in terms of biology, that surpasses in terms of medical and biological indicators the vast majority of those who live on the planet. There is a parable that has come down from the Middle Ages. A devil, having heard about love, which prevents him from seducing people, decides to consult with a saint on the theme of what love is. The saint tells him a lot. The devil listens to all this attentively, but realizes that love is an invention of people which does not really exist. Therefore, he can continue to engage in seduction in the same way as before. The thing is that there are some things in the world that are formally, lexically unprovable. And are inexpressible in lexicon, because they exist, but every time they are expressed in unique concretics. And love is also one of those things that are not codified formally, logically. And everyone must learn to love life, other people, himself, and he has to learn to do it all by himself. And for this, man must have the corresponding knowledge and skills in order to realize love, to manifest love in the practice of concrete activities. That's all for today.